Hello and welcome to the MetaStellar YouTube channel. My name is Sophie GORJANCE. I'm the Deputy Fiction Editor here at MetaStellar, and it is my pleasure to be speaking with artist, naturalist, and all-around creative dynamo, E.E. King. She has been widely published, including in Clarkesworld and Flame Tree, and MetaStellar is proud to be serializing her new novel, Gods and Monsters. Evie, welcome.
Thank you so much.
This is so exciting. I have been excited for this all week. I am lucky enough to have been a pre-reader on this book, so I know what everybody has in store. And I can't wait to give people a bit of a sneak peek. So why don't you introduce us to your book a little bit? Give us an idea of plot without spoilers, of course, and themes and anything you want to share.
Thank you so much. I've been looking forward to this all week too. Yeah, this was a really interesting book for me to write because at the time I wrote it, even though a lot of it takes place in San Francisco during the 1980s, it does go all over the place, but I was actually living in a magic town in Mexico, and magic towns are actually designated by the government. They have to have like cool architecture, and they have customs that have remained unchanged for hundreds of years. There's like, I think 42 magic towns in Mexico.
Wow.
And it also, I mean, mine was San Miguel de Allende, and magic really does, like you're thinking about someone you haven't seen in years and you round the corner and there they are. I was in this square and I saw this big church and I painted it. I had painted this church years before, had no idea this was where it was. So yeah, and I was dating a guy at the time, and he had gotten these old black and whites from his roommate. This was in LA, and I looked up and there's San Miguel de Allende. I mean, there's just interesting things. So I was writing this book. None of it takes place in Mexico, even though some of it's in China, it goes all over the world. But I don't, perhaps the magic influenced me because there is a sense of sort of casual magic, I guess. Everything's a little magical in the book.
Yeah.
And then sometimes when I write a book, I either know the ending, usually I at least know the ending. I know the beginning and the ending, and the middle has to take care of itself. But sometimes it's a lot more plotted, especially if it's a murder mystery or something like that. Whereas this one, I just kind of started writing and it just sort of wrote itself. And then I started having extreme doubts and taking parts out and putting them back in and, that sort of thing. But it kind of like characters merged in ways I found very interesting that were unplanned.
Oh, that's so interesting. The conversation between like pantsers and plotters in the author community is sometimes gets a little too serious. But it's very interesting to hear how your style sort of changed for this book, maybe influenced by the place you were living at the time. So thinking about the book, it does have a sort of like meandering feeling to its history, especially. And you incorporate a lot of real history into this book. So I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about that.
Well, yeah, actually, I really like using fact in fiction for a number of reasons. First of all, you don't have to think about ideas, they're already there. And I remember like the first time I did it, and I actually wrote about it in a series called Right Now, which is, I think they have like a Right Now for science fiction, Right Now for so different genres of literature, where different authors give you like hints of what to do. And often, I will use real history, real places, and it's interesting, stuff you wouldn't come up with on your own as well. And then there's of course social commentary, which comes in. I never really think about social commentary, but it always, when I read my stuff, then I'm like, oh yeah, I guess I do have a social commentary thing that I'm not necessarily thinking of. So using the history of real people and real places is something I love to do and look for. And then I just, get into the research. It's fun. And, maybe I don't use all of it, but sometimes I do. This is I don't know if this is a spoiler alert. It's such a slight spoiler alert.
Oh,
I'll
go
do it.
ahead.
There's a San Francisco madam who is, her history is pretty much real, except for her kids. Her kids are not real, but she is real, and she finds Napoleon tremendously sexy. So she has busts of him all over her house of ill repute.
I loved that part of the book as well, and I'm so thrilled that that is like a real historical fact that you managed to weave in because it felt so natural as well, which I think speaks to your skill. Um, so tell us, since we're talking about characters, a little bit about the characters. Like, how do we meet people? What are they about? No spoilers, of course, but sort of your main characters and what they're up to.
Yeah, it was really interesting because, as I say, I just started writing, and in fact, the first character you meet, well, the book, and I don't think this is a spoiler because it comes right out at the beginning, is that the Fates basically narrate the book. They're weaving together all these stories. So you constantly sort of have the Fates weaving these lives together. And the very first character you meet, and this was like, it's a cool thing because she does come back in the book, but not until way late. You could almost not realize it's her even. And that wasn't a planned thing. I just started writing it. It was just like coming to me. And then it completely switches to these other characters that are intertwined. And one of them is good and one of them is bad, but it's also about what fate gives us. What can we make with it? What is determined by our fate, and what can we change? And that,
Interesting. Yeah.
and I didn't really even, like I said, I didn't consider that. But my first quotes at the beginning of the book, I have, the destiny of man is in his own soul, which is Herodotus. And then I have, anatomy is destiny, Sigmund Freud. So it's kind of like, we'll take your pick. Which is it? It's not
I
both of
was
these.
I was going to bring those up, absolutely.
Oh, thank
Um,
you.
because yeah, I really love them, and I love how they tie together the themes of the book so neatly as well. Um, so if I can bring up vampires, why vampires? Because that's such an interesting choice for a novel of this structure and this type. And I don't think I've seen this choice made before, and I'm really interested in that.
Thank you. And it was, yeah, I wondered too, because it's a literary novel, a more literary novel than certainly the most vampire novels, except for maybe Interview with the Vampire is kind of literary. But yeah, I'm always hesitant to compare it, and then you have somebody saying, that's a masterpiece, why are you comparing yourself to that? So, but let me just say, I was a bit influenced by American Gods
Mm,
and that kind of feel, I
mm.
guess. But yeah, vampires is a choice I sometimes wonder about because it's such a cliche. And then there's so many vampire novels where, it's the bodice ripping vampire novel kind of thing, which this isn't at all. And I guess it just, like I say, it just started writing itself, kind of. And then, other creatures came in, including werewolves, but also Greek gods and monsters from all over the place. And so I was sort of was thinking of that, people bringing their gods and their nightmares with them wherever they travel and sharing them. So like if you go to Hawaii, there's some Japanese monsters or ghosts or something that are very prevalent, but they were brought over from Japan. It's like people don't just bring their belongings, they bring their beliefs and their fears. And then I started thinking, because the book goes all over the place. And so then I started looking, well, where are there, like, there's a kind of a monster of a vampire in most cultures, something like a vampire. Whereas werewolves, no, there's not so much. That's a more specific thing. And I mean, it's just interesting. I mean, shapeshifters, yeah, they're all over, and sometimes the vampire's a shapeshifter. But that interested me, of the universality of certain kinds of fear and monsters and nightmares, and the specificness of others.
Yeah. Wow. That's a really good point about different types of monsters being sort of local to different areas and some being sort of more broadly thought about in world cultures. That's a really good point. And it's in your title as well, Gods and Monsters. Look at that. Very topical. Which actually kind of makes me wonder, the beautiful bird in your background, a bird features quite heavily in the book as well. And I'm just finding out before we started this recording that you have experience with that. With corvids. So if you wanted to say a word about that, I'm interested.
Okay, I love talking about birds. You know, you get me on birds and I'll never shut up. I've always been interested in animal rescue, and I like any kind of animal, except human animals sometimes. But so I actually started out, well, studied it a little bit too, but I started out rescuing egrets, which is super cool. You know, the big white seabirds, and they're amazing because they really bond to you, and they also stick around for a while. So when you're coming home, you see this egret like circling your house way up and then coming down. So that was a lot of fun. But interestingly enough, like I said, I was in this magic town in Mexico, and it wasn't until a few years later when I was in Utah that I was doing a lot of bird rescue, and I started getting a lot of corvids. So it was almost like a precognition, if you will, that I was going to have now I have had a couple of crows, but I haven't been very close to them. They've been bigger and had different injuries where they sort of went through, but magpies I have raised from baby to adult, and especially one magpie, you know, stayed around with me all summer, and I'd be gardening and the magpie would be next to me doing magpie things. They're very smart. And so yeah, that was an interesting thing. And I do have an affinity for it. Well, corvids especially, they're so smart and so interesting.
Yeah, I've been reading articles about like ravens and crows and the different ways that they can begin to use tools. So it's especially exciting that you have that kind of knowledge and have been able to again work it into your book, just like with history. So something to look forward to for everybody, I think. Um, to switch gears for a second, we're going to be serializing your novel, like I mentioned at the top, which I think is pretty unique and special these days. Back in the early days of science fiction and fantasy, a lot of novels got their start, and even like all the way through serialization in magazines. But it's not something we see very often these days. So I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about sort of how the process has been and what you're looking forward to about this.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting. And in fact, I was writing and talking to an editor, not a metastellar editor, just an editor of, I think, might be Dreamforge, but maybe I'm misspeaking. So excuse me, editors, if I have misspoken, but they said, oh no, I know it was Dave from Tangent, the reviewing magazine. He was really nice, but he was like, wow, it's a long serialization, like it's going to go on for a while. And so I'm really interested to see how that works. Now, also, if you come in the middle, you can go though and start back at the beginning and go to the middle. Or if you're like, I just want to read it more together, you could even wait and, you know, read bigger chunks of it. I think, I mean, I have a couple of books that in some ways to me, they're almost more normal, would be make a more normal serialization, like one is a murder mystery or one is a guide to the afterlife. So you have all these different afterlife sections. But works well, I think, because it's so many different stories woven together. So some of them almost work as their own bits. And so I think that's interesting. Now I'm not a good writer of even chapters. My chapters are always like, either they can be like a page or they can go on, and be more normal chapter lengths. And especially in this book, because you switch characters, you switch points of view, some of them's told in the first person, it shifts to the third person. Like I said, I just sort of let it happen. And so that's, I think, makes it good for serialization. But because of that, I tried to do sections, and because I'll be narrating it as we go along, which is really fun too. So you can listen, you can listen while you're doing chores and say, oh my gosh, or whatever you say when you listen to things. I don't know. But I did it in sections. They aren't too long because I'm narrating them. And so I divided the book into 44 sections, which was fun. Though actually it's not, that kind of division is something I really am very, very bad at. So the first time I did it, I realized somehow I'd omitted a whole section. I had to go back and divide it again.
Oh no, I hadn't heard that as you were doing that. Well, I'm glad we figured that out before we got too far in the process.
Me too. I was like, wait a minute.
Yeah. Oh, excuse me. I'm sorry. Um, oh gosh. Um,
Sneeze just
yes,
took
I'm sorry. Knocked my brain right out my ear. So is there anything that you want to sort of like clue readers in about? Anything to sort of draw people in?
Well, I did hesitate. You asked me about vampires, and a lot of people are just like, vampires, no. And I think people that might like this book, the idea of vampires might turn them off. So that's kind of a dangerous thing to play with in a way. So I guess I want to say it is a bit more literary than your average vampire novel. And then it deals with a lot of topics that aren't usually in vampire novels. I mean, this isn't a bodice ripper for sure. I don't know that there are any bodice rippers in there. There's a little part that's a bit horror, I would say, a bit, it's horrified me anyway. When I wrote it, I was like, oh no, this is happening. But there's like gods and monsters and birds and a lot of San Francisco history, as well as history of the Lenni Indian tribe, which really fascinated me. And then interesting facts about not just corvids, but pigeons.
There is a lot to say about pigeons. Um, I'm glad people will be getting a chance to hear something about that as well. Um, well, if you don't have anything further to add, this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for sitting down with me today. If everybody has enjoyed this video, we would very much appreciate a like, a subscribe, a comment. Tell us what you're excited about. Then if you want to support the publications that we're doing on MetaStellar, we have a Patreon, which will be linked below. And the link to the first chapter of Gods and Monsters, as well as the recording, will also be linked in the description. You can go ahead and give those a click to check out everything that we've been talking about. And thank you for sticking with us. Have a great day.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Evie.